Now, if we can talk a little bit about the U.S. domestic politics, besides mastering its foreign policy, you, although not an insider, you know Washington, you know the Congress, you know the American society. You witnessed the Vietnam War already 50 years ago, and that must give you a wisdom that can only come with years. So, in 2008, I believe what we saw in a way was that the U.S. political system gained credibility after the crease of the presidency of George Bush. But also the polarization, it seems, changed at the national level. And we have now, the president is accused of being a socialist. The National Rifle Association and party are very creative, especially when it comes to negative campaigns. And the question is, in terms of a polarized society, do you see elements to worry, or is this just the contemporary representation of U.S. pluralism?
Well, that's a very good question. You know, I think to put this in terms that we can relate to at CEU especially, I think open society is facing a major contest around the world, including in the United States. Certainly open and free speech is an important element of open society. But so is democratic politics, that is to say, the ability to solve problems peacefully and to do so in a regular political process. And in many places, that's more and more difficult. For a whole lot of complicated reasons, including the proliferation of new media and all the instant communications, and the fact that political leaders are living constantly under having to react instantly to almost anything that takes place. So there are very good developments in the sense that there's more participation. I'm not yet really answering about the United States, I know, but I'm talking more generally about the world. There is more participation, more engagement, particularly through media elements and also across borders. But I think given the economic crisis, there's a lot of uncertainty and fear and insecurity, and that leads sometimes to insularity. I think we see that here in Hungary, we see that in Central Europe. And to some extent, I think the polarization of politics in the United States relates to this larger phenomenon. I think the election of Barack Obama, and particularly the coalition that re-elected him to office in last year, in 2012, is a demonstration that the United States is truly a pluralist and diverse society. We now have, we're very almost on the verge of having what I would call a majority-minority society, which is the majority of people in the United States are otherwise considered to be minorities. In some ways, this mirrors CEU, so I would connect this with CEU. This is a very positive development, that the world would have so much diversity that we know it has, but also diversity scares people sometimes, and it makes them feel that their own kind is under some attack. Right now, I think we have, in the politics of the United States, a polarization which results from certain elements in the political system, particularly those that have been labeled the Tea Party, or those who are essentially against any kind of government action for social purposes, social benefits. They're acting in part out of fear, out of their loss of status and standing in a society that is becoming increasingly majority-minority. But I am optimistic. I think the world is heading in a direction, the United States is heading in a direction where more participation and more diversity is ultimately going to lead to new forms of open society and new forms of democratic governance. And so we're in a very transitional period in the world right now, but it's an exciting period. And here again, CEU in many respects is intellectually, morally in the center of all of that.
Yes, and it's funny that now that you speak about CUI, it reminds me. Whenever I talk with my teammates from the newspaper and others, I think the way we experience CEU is that, being most of us from outside Hungary, when we're in Budapest, we're citizens from this university, and CEU is to us like a republic in many ways that provides you also the opportunity to be a virtuous citizen if you choose so. So there will always be something you can do that contributes to the university and also adds to yourself in terms of experience, rewards, etc. So interesting to hear that, Rector. Now going back to the US, let me ask you something about an issue that right now it's on the headlights, the use of drones. And I think there are two overlapping things here. On one hand, and I will quote, the American Civil Liberties Union says that the targeted killing program operates with virtually no oversight outside the executive branch, and essential details about the program remain secret, including what criteria are used to put people on CIA and military kill lists, or how much evidence is required. Also, it continues, and I quote, the US continues to carry out illegal targeted killings in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and elsewhere. The government must be held to account when it carries out such killings in violation of the Constitution and international law. So there is this, but there has been, as these targeted killings have involved US citizens, there is now a discussion in the media about banning the use of drones and targeted killings without due process on American citizens. And if this were the case, we could be facing a situation in which there are two kinds of world citizens: Americans who cannot be killed without a due process, and all the others who could be targeted by a decision of the US executive without regard of any legal proceedings. So, keeping in mind your civil rights lawyer perspective, but also your policymaker experience, what could, and I know there's not a straightforward answer to this, and there's tensions between the imperatives of security and human rights, but what could be a way forward? What would you advise?
Well, I think this is one of the most important issues for international security and in many respects for US foreign policy. I think the use of drones, or even more generally, mechanized warfare with little human intervention, tanks and the like, is probably inevitable in the sense that it's going to come in the future. But it's disturbing. It's also seductive because you can imagine, as a president, you don't really want to deploy hundreds of thousands of troops. President Obama is in the process of disengaging from Afghanistan and from Iraq. So he's actually, at the same time that he's making use of these mechanized warfare machines, he's also disengaging US forces. But what's seductive about the drones is that you can essentially operate them without the engagement of forces on the ground. You can probably limit the amount of civilian damage that's done in a setting where you're doing counterterrorism or you're even fighting a war. But in a setting where they're completely unregulated, either by international law or domestic law, I worry that we're entering into a world that is really going to be lawless, and that drones are certainly not going to be the sole the sole purview of the United States. There are other countries and even other shadowy forces in the world, including terrorists, who might end up using them. So my own view is that there needs to be a high degree of regulation brought to bear on this. And I'm glad to see that there is now some debate beginning in the United States, including within the administration itself, as well as in the Congress, about requiring a much more elaborate system of checks and balances against the use of these kinds of mechanisms. Now, there are some examples of regulation that have worked. in the field of electronic surveillance, for example, wiretapping or overhearing of other conversations, which has been a standard security tactic of all governments for a long time. The United States, and I was involved in this when I was a lawyer for the American Civil Liberties Union, enacted a statute in 1978 called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And it required a court to oversee the intelligence wiretapping that was being done by security agencies involving, in this case, American citizens, and requiring some kind of judicial warrant or oversight that would be applied in this, so it would not be simply the decision of a few bureaucrats or even the president alone. Now, that's not a perfect solution either. The critics of that solution say, well, it's not really very effective oversight. But the policymaker in me says that we should make sure that we develop systems that are workable, because if we try to develop systems that are unworkable, then it's likely that something else is going to happen that could be even worse, other aspects of the use of drones. So this is a disturbing future part of the 21st century that we're looking at. And it's not just the United States, it's not just the drones that have been used so far, but it's this whole mechanized conflict and warfare that I see developing. And here, as an international lawyer, I'm a very strong advocate of developing through the United Nations and through treaty mechanisms, just as has been done in the case of nuclear arms, a much better system of regulating and limiting the use of these mechanical devices. And certainly, as you say in your question, it would be unfortunate if there are sort of two worlds, that is, the world outside of the United States, the world inside the United States. That's why I think this is a worldwide phenomenon. It needs to be developed to regulate the whole system. Now, that's not going to be easy, but there have been other systems of international law that have been developed in the past, and I think we should be able to do this. And the fact that there is a debate now going on in the United States about this is a good sign.
Great. Well, we will keep an eye on that, and it's going to be an unfolding debate. Hopefully, it will be, as you say, regulated, and some oversight and due process will be involved.